The very strong growth in employment in 2014, do we know how much of that can be attributed to the energy sector? And a corollary to that would be, what would you say to all these Texans that claim that half of the growth in employment can be attributed to the state of Texas and the other half to the other 49 states?
One of the things you learn in this job is not to pick fights with other states. So, I'm not going to give you a sharp answer off the top of my head about how much is from energy, but you have to recognize that actually by the end of the year, we're actually starting to see a drag on employment from energy because of the decline in energy prices. My reading of the data is what happened in 2014 is relatively broad-based, and I wouldn't highlight energy in particular. I think construction also came back pretty strong, has been coming back pretty strongly, for example, around this district and but also around the country. One of the things you do see is if you divide up employment population by male and female, female employment to population did not fall by as much as male, but it has not come back as strongly. And I think this is related to where we saw construction and manufacturing which are more male dominated in terms of employment, take big hits in terms of employment during the recession, and they have come back more strongly since the end of that time.
Wayne Gardella with the Small Business Administration. So in Montana right now we have an unemployment rate of around 4%. And although I slept through my 2 economic classes in undergrad, if I do the math right, 0.09% growth through 2018, the only way Montana's going to be able to keep that growth is if we import a labor force, and we'll be at 0. But based on those statistics that you have for a national basis, what would you expect the unemployment rate to be in the country at 2018?
I think it's a great question, and it's something we're struggling with because my long-run estimate for where unemployment would be has fallen over the last couple of years quite dramatically. My estimate was probably over 6% if you go back a couple of years, and it's now down to 5%, and we're reevaluating that. And the reason we're reevaluating that is because we have not seen significant wage pressures emerging. That's what would mean we're close to the long-run level. We haven't seen significant price pressures, inflation pressures emerging, as I've documented more clearly. So I would say right now we're at 5, but looking probably to go lower in terms of that. That means that I'm thinking that work workers are going to come from is in part through an increase in the labor force participation as well as a decline in the unemployment rate. And so, I did not show you any metrics on unemployment. And if you go back to this December 2009, this time period, December 2009 to December 2013, we were seeing a decline in the unemployment rate over this time frame. But we weren't seeing any increase in the employment population ratio. That's because it was all coming from a decline in labor force participation. And the question is, how many of those people will come back into the labor force if demand for labor improves sufficiently? I will say there is definitely estimation and guesswork to be had on that question. I'll say one thing about Montana. I think Montana and my home state of Minnesota both have very low unemployment rates. I think Minnesota is slightly lower. But the state of the labor market is not as strong in those states as that metric would lead you to think. And the reason I say that is if you look at a metric like the fraction of people who are working part-time but would like to work more hours, that remains quite high by historical standards in both Minnesota and Montana. And I think that's, and this is more theory than empirics, but I think that contributes to downward pressure on wages. You've got people who are working a relatively small number of hours relative to what they would like to work, and that puts downward pressure on wages, and that also keeps prices in check. And if you look at the rate of price inflation in the Twin Cities, which has an unemployment rate close to 3%, it does not look very different from the national average at all. So I think that I've focused on the employment population ratio here because I think it's giving you a better picture of where the labor market really is, because it's capturing the fact that because of adverse demand conditions, people left the labor force, but those people can be brought back, or at least some of them can be brought back into the labor force.
I think at the very end of your presentation, you, correct me if I'm wrong, you said you're against recommending an increase in the rate. Well, given that there's, we're continuing to recover and there's been some signs of improvement in the labor market, could you say some more about your hesitancy to, not a percentage point, half a percent, a quarter percent. What's the concern there?
It's a great question. The decisions about monetary policy always seem small in and of themselves. It's always about, should we move the interbank lending rate by a quarter of a percentage point, the one-day rate, should we move that by a quarter of a percentage point? And it's always about communicating really what you're thinking about the stance of monetary policy over the longer term. What is that going to look like? I think if we were to raise rates, given my outlook for inflation, if we were to raise rates in 2015, we would be sending the signal that we're not prepared to be sufficiently accommodative in the pursuit of our 2% inflation target. We're seeing inflation run close to zero right now, and we're a long ways from getting back to our 2% inflation target. That risks markets, our credibility. It risks the credibility of that 2% inflation target. We've already seen signs of that in markets. So if you look at what people are willing to pay for a Treasury inflation protected security versus a normal Treasury, it shows that what they're betting the inflation rate will be in 5 to 10 years from now has fallen significantly from over the last year. That's a sign that we're running the risk of losing our credibility of that 2% inflation target. On the employment front, yeah, we've had improvement, but I'll show you this picture again. I think there's room for improvement relative to where we are. Here we are. I think we can do better than that. So, and doing better faster is better than doing better slowly.
Dr. Kocherlakota, thank you for being here again. Appreciate your time. I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question and ask you to transport yourself back to 2009. And then, given the set of economic conditions that exist today, 5.5% unemployment, a labor force participation rate that is stabilized, we're seeing equity capital markets at all-time highs. Would you then look at, and I'm going to harken you back to the question that I asked you last year about the stock versus flow of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, $4 trillion balance sheet, and you answered that the stock, the size of it was far more important than the ongoing quantitative easing program. Given that set of circumstances, viewing that back in 2009, would you envision this being a period of time where essentially emergency monetary policy accommodation would still be appropriate? And would it make sense to have some degree or some capacity to provide further accommodation if we get future weakness and therefore not maintain the current zero interest rate policy? So a little bit of a loaded question and maybe a softball for you, but I'd like you to answer that hypothetical question.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Suppose we were, I'd been told in 2009 we'd be back to 5.5% unemployment and inflation would be, well, let's focus on core. Headline, we've obviously got these influences of gasoline prices that we want to strip out. But if I'd been told that core would be around 1.3 or so, I think that I would have thought that we would have been on a path already of increasing interest rates, frankly, if I'd been told that. I think the key to understanding why we're not there is really about sort of the pace of recovery that's brought us to that point and where the pace of recovery is going to be going forward as well. And that's what's showing up, I think, in the need for low interest rates in order to facilitate the outcomes that we're currently enjoying. Basically, I would have thought that the financial market conditions would have improved enough that we would not have needed the low interest rate policy we have in place to generate these outcomes. But I would have been wrong in 2009. That's all. There are other things I was wrong about in 2009, but I won't go through them all. I want to respect people's time. You asked about a number of parts of your question. I lost track of some of it. Anything else you want to highlight quickly?
Well, without the microphone,
Yes.
I'll speak up. Just simply the capacity of the Federal
capacity.
Reserve to provide
Yeah.
further accommodation should conditions weaken further, given that we remain at a $4 trillion balance sheet, unlikely to restart a QE and at zero interest rate policy.
So I think that the question is basically about shouldn't we raise rates so we can have more capacity to fight a recession if it were to come along? This is, I think, like you don't want to, you want the patient to be as healthy as possible if another illness is going to come. And the way to keep the patient as healthy as possible is to keep accommodation in place now. And if we raise rates now, we weaken the course of recovery, we weaken where employment's going to be going. And if a shock happens, we're going to be even worse off as a result. The situation is one, you use the term emergency, and to refer to what we're doing in terms of monetary policy. I think that interest rates are going to continue to be low for quite some time to come, lower than they were historically. I don't think of that as being an emergency. It's about what kinds of policy you have to follow given the existing conditions in order to achieve the outcomes we want to see. Having good employment outcomes, good price level outcomes. The world has changed since 2006 in the sense we need to have lower interest rates than we would have had before that in order to achieve those outcomes.